Nick Mabey now. He's the chief executive of third generation environmentalism, a climate change think tank, and he's joining us from Glasgow. Nick Mabey, good to have you with us here on TRT World. So as I said, the draft agreement is out. What were your reactions, thoughts about what you've read so far?
Well, to be honest, quite pleasantly surprised. We were told when the original text came out on Wednesday, this was the ceiling agreement. Well, it's got strengthened. There's a lot more there for everybody, really. Is more on tightening up mitigation. There's more on helping countries deal with the damages of climate change, and more to help and make sure countries stick to their promises. But I think it's going to have to go back to leaders, because this will breach the negotiating red lines of many of the countries at the conference.
Absolutely. Well, let's just dig into some of that then, Nick. You mentioned the negotiating red lines. That'll be specifically, I guess, in terms of money, but also in terms of checking countries and their carbon emissions, because that is one of the issues that's at hand here, isn't it? Places like China and Saudi Arabia having sort of independent verification of how much carbon they are emitting per year.
Yes, what we hear, and it's still to see that those negotiations on what we call the transparency rules don't seem to be going too badly. But I think the big objections from China, from Russia as well, and Saudi Arabia will be on the stronger language to say everybody's got to come back next year with new targets for the next decade. That was the big demand from the vulnerable countries. It's in this text more strongly than in the previous text, and that's going to be a big ask for some of the big fossil fuel polluters.
We'll talk about that idea of coming back again next year to do it all again. I wonder if they'll do it remotely this time rather than flying people in on jets, but I digress. The money, Nick, 100 billion was promised a number of years ago. It wasn't delivered last year. They had their own reasons. Where are we on that 100 billion going from the rich nations to the poorer nations to make sure they can curb their carbon emissions?
Well, the rich nations are late in delivery. They issued a roadmap before COP showing that they may deliver that into next year or the year after, and then increase beyond it. So, we expect them to deliver over the next 5 years an average of 100 billion, but the language isn't as strong as it needs to be. And to be honest, people need a lot more than that money if they're going to respond to climate change. So one of the things I expect people to come back with is requests for more financing. In order to get more ambition, there needs to be more financing. Certainly, India's been very strong on that point, and that's something I'd expect in response to the text.
And coming back then next year, Nick, is that likely then? And what are the sort of reservations from some of those countries you mentioned about coming back and talking again next year to kind of keep everyone's attention where it needs to be?
Well, fundamentally, it's discussing whether we go for the lower Paris temperature goal of 1.5 degrees or the well below 2 target. And this is, the science has changed since the Paris Agreement is very clear, and the text says, and everybody agrees, that damages are much higher than people predicted. So there's a real push to make efforts, pursue efforts, as said in Paris, to get below that lower agreement. And most countries' targets are not consistent with that. And so that's why we have to come back next year, not just to talk more, but for countries to actually align their targets in the short term with the science of this lower target. And I think that underlying all this, what looks like talk, is just a very fundamental question. How much risk are you prepared to take? Are you willing to let the world warm double what it's already warmed, where we're seeing devastating floods and catastrophes everywhere? Or are you going to try and limit warming as much as we possibly can to make everybody safer?
I mean, that element of risk is obviously inherent in all of this, isn't it, Nick? And I did hear an opinion earlier that I thought was quite interesting, that it's sort of existential for some of those low-lying nations, island nations, if the world warms and the sea levels rise, but also existential for places like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, who rely on fossil fuels for their economies. So how do you sort of square that?
In the end, fossil fuels run out, but we have the climate for thousands of years. So it's very clear the cost-benefit is it's better for everybody, including Saudi Arabia and Qatar, who have huge climate damages. It might be impossible to work outside in either country if we don't limit warming. And actually, both countries have huge potential to become solar power champions, and they're already investing in the area. So even for the most fossil-dependent nations, like Russia or Saudi or Qatar, this is a good choice. And so it's just back to saying, are you investing in your long-term or short-term prosperity? There is no long-term prosperity on a warming planet. Everybody loses. There's no demand for your oil. So again, Short term, it sounds hard, but long term, this is the only option for people because there is no future on a burning planet.
Absolutely not. Okay, Nick Mabey from Third Generation Environmentalism, thank you very much for your expertise. We're hoping for the final communique to come from COP in the next few hours.